Hello, and welcome to Eastern Roman History. I have the great privilege to welcome Professor David Parnell of Indiana University, Northwest. He is a historian of 6th century Roman military and social history, most recently writing a book on Belisarius and Antonina, and I have invited him here today to explore these two individuals further. Would you like to introduce yourself and your expertise further, Professor?
Yes, thank you for that lovely introduction. It is wonderful to be talking with you today about Belisarius and Antonina, two individuals that have consumed an inordinate amount of my attention over the past couple of years. I have a PhD, a doctorate in medieval history with a specialty in Byzantine and Roman history. And I have focused most of my career on the 6th century. And most of my career has been spent focusing on the relationships between individuals and the networks that tie individuals together. So with this project, I'm looking a little more closely at a very specific relationship, a marriage between Belisarius and Antonina, and what it can tell us about both their lives and broader Roman society in the 6th century.
Yes, looking into the lives of some of these people can sometimes tell you more about how society worked than a more general overview where you learn about people, but you don't really learn about individuals in some respects. So the story of Belisarius and Antonina is very captivating. I understand many years ago there had been a biography by Lord Mahon about Belisarius, and I was just wondering what kind of historiography has gone into Belisarius and Antonina?
That's a great question, and it's one of the reasons that drew me to their marriage and their relationship is that there is not really a whole lot written about it specifically. So you correctly pointed out the last general academic biography of Belisarius's life as a whole was that of Lord Mahon's, which is now almost 200 years old, written in the 1820s. There is a more recent military biography of Belisarius written by Ian Hughes, which came out, about 12 years ago now. So that's much more recent. But as I said, it's mostly a military biography. It looks at his career in the military, it looks at his strategic and tactical decisions, and does not have much to say about the rest of his life. So I became very interested in the pieces of Belisarius's life that sort of fill in the picture. Not that his military career is uninteresting. I have plenty to say about that in my research, but there's more to his life than just the battles he fought. And that's sort of what drew me to the subject, is there has not been a lot written about him in that vein in many, many years.
And hopefully we will have a chance to explore some of those facets in both fields. Since we're covering two individuals, let's start with Belisarius. I was wanting to ask you, what can Belisarius's career tell us about the Roman military machine at this time? So, the 6th century.
It's a great question, and the answer is that Belisarius's career tells us almost everything we know about the Roman military in the 6th century. We are extremely well informed about Belisarius, his career, his campaigns, thanks to the work of his secretary, his legal aide, and his constant historian, Procopius of Caesarea, who wrote a very lengthy history of the wars that Justinian waged, with Belisarius fighting as his preeminent general in those wars. So Belisarius stands at the fulcrum of military activity in the 6th century. The entire century can be sort of divided up into before Belisarius's career and after Belisarius's career, because it is that pivotal. So I think in terms of military history in general and the history of the 6th century in particular, Belisarius is indispensable when you're talking about the military and its operations.
There was a funny little thing that my university professor told me, how Anthony Caldellus, when he was writing his book of this era, was criticizing Procopius and sort of warning against being too reliant upon it. But when he came to write the military history of the era, he was basically copying Procopius. So it does kind of emphasize how much we are reliant upon Procopius to write the history at the time, and part of that focus means that you have to incorporate Belisarius. But of course, Belisarius wasn't the only general of Justinian's reign, and we do have some almost biographical works, such as Corippus's epic poem about John Troglodyte. And my next question would be, could you do the same for someone like John Troglodyte as you'd be able to with Belisarius in terms of research and what we can learn?
I would give a qualified yes to that question. I think it's certainly possible to write detailed histories of other generals of the 6th century. Belisarius, although he comes through very clearly in the works of Procopius, as you point out, is not the only general of the period, not the only general serving the Emperor Justinian. And I would add, he's not even the only successful general of the period. I think Belisarius gets a lot of fame, justly, for his victories, but even within his lifetime, there were other generals winning quite substantial victories. The general Sittus won a victory against the Persians in 530, the same year that Belisarius defeated them at the Battle of Dara. And Narses, of course, was the one who finally defeated the Goths in the 550s after Belisarius had already retired. So I think it's fair to point out that there are other generals who are perhaps even as successful as Belisarius, at least in individual battles, even though they don't have the same fame as Belisarius does. So I think it is possible to write interesting microbiographies of their lives. And there is a very good biography of Narses in particular that was written by a historian named Brodka, which I can get you the full reference to. So it's possible. It's just a little easier with Belisarius since there's a little more source material.
Yes, I have read myself Narses, the Hammer of the Goths, and it can be quite detailed about the military operations, but sort of everything else is kind of, well, we've heard this from this quite late source, or this and that and the other. How was Belisarius able to be as successful as he was during campaigning?
Belisarius is an interesting general in that, as far as we can tell from what Procopius has to say about him, he had quite a few interests as a general. He was not singularly focused on simply defeating the enemy in battle. He was equally as concerned with the morale of his soldiers, with the relationship his soldiers had with the civilian populations amongst whom they were fighting, and with his own relationship with his officers. He was very keen to preserve a amity with them and a functional sort of working relationship, a network. And I think that makes him a little bit different than a general we might imagine to sort of be singularly focused, singularly driven on victory, perhaps as we imagined Alexander the Great, for example.
I suppose the thing to ask would be, how does Belisarius' style of command bring him victory against the opponents he is fighting, such as the Vandals and the Goths and the Persians? Is it more of consistent strategy that he is employing, or is it, and could you also factor in the ability of the Roman army at this point, or is it perhaps more just Belisarius being a very good commander, or is it the opponents he's going up against, or a factor of all three of them?
Yes, you've asked a question here that I think historians have been wrestling with for quite a long time when they look at the history of these wars. And the easiest answer, not that it's easy to unpack, seems to be the all the above response, that all of this plays some role in Belisarius's victories. Certainly, we can credit some of his tactical decisions. He is very careful to present his army in ways that will enable him to earn victory. We see this clearly in the Vandal campaign when he cautiously has his army disembark from their ships 150 miles from Carthage rather than trying for the daring surprise strike directly on Carthage itself.
Like in the Leo I expedition.
Right. Yes. So a big contrast with the generalship of Basilicus in that 468 expedition of Leo I. And Belisarius then carefully arranges his army to march from their landing site, Cheba, to Carthage, 150 miles, so that there's both a vanguard and guards along the western wing to protect against Vandal attacks. And this is, I think, a good example of his preparation for success. But of course, there's also luck, because one of the features, again, of the Vandal campaign is that some of the Vandal army was away in Sardinia putting down a revolt at the time that Belisarius landed in North Africa. Would he have been as successful if they hadn't been? We can't know for sure. So there's an element of luck there. And then there's, of course, the way that Belisarius works with his officers and has their trust and enables them to carry out their own actions. So in the Battle of Ad Decimum in that Vandal campaign, both the vanguard and the guard along the western flank make their own independent choices when they engage elements of Gelimer's army. And this turns out to be very advantageous to the battle. And this is something that you may not see with a general who's got a tighter control of his officers and wants them to report in before they do anything or something like that.
I understand that Belisarius is sometimes called more of a cavalry commander than an infantry commander, especially when you compare his career to someone like Narses, who heavily relies on infantry and dismounted cavalry to win battles such as at Taginae. Do you think this is true? And if so, why potentially was Belisarius so reliant on cavalry?
So we have a difficult knot to untangle here, because Belisarius comes through as reliant on cavalry in the History of the Wars by Procopius. Now, is that because he was truly reliant on cavalry, or is it because Procopius chose to write up the battles that way because most of the officers and soldiers Procopius knew were cavalry troopers, and he's trying to sort of highlight their role? We also have this famous passage at the beginning of the History of the Wars in which Procopius extols the virtues of the mounted archers of the Roman army in the 6th century. This is not a type of a soldier unit that we might expect, but apparently in the 6th century, the Romans had a contingent of cavalry who were equally proficient with lance, sword, and bow, while on horseback. And this, Procopius argues, is one of the reasons for Belisarius's decisive early victories against the Vandals and the Ostrogoths in Italy. So is it really the case that this was what enabled Belisarius to win, or is this just Procopius trying to present a thesis and then prove it in the history of the wars? I think that's an interesting question to ask of our source.
I suppose a follow-up question would be, from historians like John Malalas, do you get a different impression? Although I do know the nature of Malalas's history is very different, so...
Yes, so yeah, we could go over that briefly for the listeners. The Malalas history is a chronicle, which means it's much more terse, for one thing. So we have very short entries for each year. Some years the entries are longer, but it's not a narrative history in the style of the History of the Wars by Procopius. So we're dealing with a little bit less detailed information. But what we do have in Malalas is some interesting indications that Belisarius is relying on his cavalry in his battles in the east against the Persians at both Dara and at Callinicum. The way he sets up his lines for battle, his battle formation, indicates heavy preference for using his cavalry to strike against the Persians with the infantry in reserve. Malalas does not tell us as much about whether those infantry are or those cavalry are as proficient with bow as with lance as Procopius does, but we do at least see the prevalence of cavalry there.
Well, let's shift the focus a little and think about Belisarius himself. Is he a typical Roman general in this period? How does Belisarius fit into Roman society and perhaps generals more broadly?
So I have two answers to that question. On the surface, when you look at his career as a whole, Belisarius appears to be a fairly typical Roman general of the period. If you take away the obvious successes that he had and his triumphs and all of that, and just look at his career, it's not necessarily all that unusual. There were many generals of this period who had a career that spanned 20 years or so. And we know Belisarius's active career was probably at least 25 years. So his length of his career is not unusual. Belisarius won many battles over the course of his career, but he also lost many battles over the course of his career, and he suffered disgrace at various points where he was stripped of his command, stripped of his wealth, even stripped of his armed followers, his bugallari, his guardsmen. And this is not unusual either. We see this with other generals, that careers tend to be sort of up and down for generals in this period. You win a victory and the emperor promotes you. You lose a battle and the emperor recalls you. You do something that makes the emperor suspicious and the emperor recalls you. But Justinian tends towards forgiveness and second chances with his generals. So very frequently we see them returning to command even after they've been dismissed by the emperor. So all that is to say that in that context, the career of Belisarius does not appear all that unusual. What makes him perhaps unusual, and this is maybe a segue to another part of our discussion, I think, is his relationship with his wife. We know far more about Belisarius's wife, Antonina, than we do about any other military wife of this period. She is his constant companion. She travels with him on campaign. We know that she was present in at least 3 different regional campaigns in North Africa, in Italy, and along the Mesopotamian frontier in the east against the Persians. And we don't know of any other military wife in this period who traveled so broadly. And clearly, Belisarius drew strength from her presence. And there was something important about her presence and their partnership that enabled whatever his career became. The exact nature of that is hard to suss out, but there's clearly something important there. And I think that perhaps makes Belisarius stand out a bit amongst his peer group.
No, I think that's very interesting. Every so often you do see a commander's wife appear. So like the wife of Aetius or the Empress Martina with Heraclius in the following century. But you don't really see military wives standing out that often. I mean, these are like very small examples across 3 centuries, so it's quite rare they actually get to see them in action, so to speak. So, are there other examples of military wives being influential with their husbands in this period?
That's a great question. And as far as I have seen, the answer is no. We do see occasionally wives of generals appearing with their spouses. So the general Ariobindus, when he was sent to North Africa in the 540s to take command there, did travel with his wife, Praecta. We know that she was present, but we don't know if she had any role to play, if she had any say in what he did, or if she just simply came and sat in the palace in Carthage while Ariobindus carried out his duties. With Antonina, we have so much information about the way that she traveled with Belisarius, the way that she interacted with important figures like popes, praetorian prefects, and on occasion even helped him to command portions of his army, which seems incredibly hard to believe, but we have it there in the sources laid out for us. And this is a role for Antonina which seems like it could be unprecedented. Or perhaps there are other military wives that are equally as active, and they just were not lucky enough to have a first-class historian like Procopius tagging along in the household to write down her activities.
I do think that's perhaps an issue with that one. But would you like to give us an example of Antonina being unusually active, let's say?
Yes. So let me set the stage here. In 536 in December, Belisarius, Antonina, and the Roman army marched into the city of Rome. And so Rome was controlled by the Roman Empire for the first time in a space of 60 years. But the Ostrogoths were not defeated. So King Witiges of the Ostrogoths rallied the Ostrogothic army, traveled south, and set up a siege around the city of Rome. The siege of Rome lasted from roughly March 537 till the following year, 538, so about a year. Over the course of this siege, Belisarius is requesting reinforcements and supplies from Justinian to increase the size of his army to enable him to break the siege and defeat the Ostrogoths. At one point, we learn that supplies and reinforcements have arrived at Naples to Rome south. So Belisarius sends out his secretary, Procopius, and also his wife, Antonina. And Procopius tells us very casually that Antonina and he were together organizing the supplies and the reinforcements to travel from Naples to Rome. And then Procopius disappears to go back to report to Belisarius. And so we're told that it is Antonina who is doing this organization. So she organizes the transport of the supplies and these reinforcing soldiers from Naples up to Rome. They arrive at Ostia, Rome's old port. And then Procopius tells us Antonina, with the other officers, was considering how to transport the supplies from Ostia into the city of Rome itself. And it's very interesting and very indicative of Antonina's role that she is mentioned here in the same sentence as military officers. She is presented as either on the same level as them or perhaps even commanding them and organizing this process. So this is, as far as I know, unprecedented that a military wife would be sort of directing officers like this and setting up an operation. Not a combat operation, granted, but she is commanding soldiers, officers, and organizing this supply train into Rome. And this is presented to us by Procopius in language that makes it seem totally normal and expected, even though, as far as we can tell, it is shockingly unusual and unprecedented.
Does feel a little out of place, and well, I do know there's sort of on the one hand, how Romans like to present the ideals of a man and woman, and then how things practically play out. So it's interesting to see some of the practical things going on in this period. Let's think a little bit about Antonina and her relationship to the Empress Theodora. How important was that relationship for both Belisarius and Antonina?
This is a great question. So we don't know for sure how far back the relationship between Antonina and Theodora goes. It's been imagined in the past that they were friends from long ago. But this is based on a misconception that Antonina was herself an actress in the same way Theodora had been when she was younger.
Right.
And we simply don't know that for sure. Antonina is described as the daughter of an actress, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she herself was an actress. So I think part of the question with Antonina's life is, when exactly did she meet Theodora? When did she strike up a relationship with her, a relationship which, as far as we can tell, did eventually develop into one of mutual respect, perhaps even friendship, we might call it. So it's not clear quite when they struck up this relationship. I think, however, that Antonina must have known Theodora before she married Belisarius, because it makes the most sense that Antonina would have met Belisarius through the agency of Theodora. Belisarius was serving the Emperor Justinian as a guardsman in this early phase of his career, and Antonina perhaps knew Theodora, so it makes sense that they would have crossed paths through the agency of Justinian and Theodora. So Antonina's relationship with Theodora perhaps enabled her to meet her husband, Belisarius, and certainly enabled her to have high-level discussions in the palace with somebody in perhaps a way she could not with Justinian, since she was a woman. So I think that her relationship with Theodora was quite important for her own sense of power and place in society. Whether her relationship with Theodora was crucial for Belisarius, I think, is an interesting question. Belisarius already was close with Justinian, so it's not like he needed an in with the imperial couple, but it probably couldn't have hurted to have had a sort of back door into the imperial bedroom, as it were, by having his wife have a personal friendship with the empress. And we see at the end of Belisarius' career in 548, him attempting to use this sort of backdoor influence when he sends Antonina to Constantinople to Theodora to beg Justinian for reinforcements during his second campaign in Italy. It's not that he hadn't tried the official channels. Belisarius had written many letters directly to Justinian, as a general was supposed to do, to request reinforcements and such things. And Justinian simply was not prioritizing Italy. So these letters were not getting the desired response. So Belisarius thought, okay, I will send Antonina. She will talk to Theodora. We'll see if we can go an end around to Justinian that way to get some help. And famously, when Antonina arrived in Constantinople in June or July of 548, she found out that Theodora had just passed. And so she was not able to have that meeting with her. But this shows us, at least potentially, what Belisarius and Antonina envisioned that relationship with Theodora to be able to accomplish for them.
Right. I mean, do we have any other examples of people being able to do that in Justinian's reign? Maybe someone like Germanus, Justinian's brother. Brother? Cousin?
Cousin.
Cousin, yes, that's it.
So as far as we can tell, Germanus and Theodora did not get along. So he would not have had a relationship with her that would have enabled him to do that. So yes, I'm not sure we have any other good examples of a general's wife using her relationship with Theodora to try to enact change for her spouse, the general, through Justinian. We weave complicated webs here thinking about this. But we do know Theodora was very active in the lives of generals in the empire. So there is that general Ariobindus I mentioned earlier was killed in a mutiny in North Africa. And his wife, Praecta, was then a widow and eligible for remarriage. So there was a general in North Africa who successfully defeated the rebel. And this general wanted to marry Praecta because she was seen as a great catch. So this general was named Artabanes. Well, as this general was seeking Praecta's hand, another woman appeared out of nowhere and went to the imperial court and sought an audience with Theodora. And she said to the empress, "I am Artabanes' wife. He can't marry Praecta because he's married to me." And so the Empress Theodora then intervened and quashed Artabanes' dream of marrying Praecta and said, no, you have to go back to your wife who you left at home and tried to pretend didn't exist. So this is not the same thing as what you're asking, but it's evidence that Theodora is is aware of the relationships of the top generals in the empire in a very interesting way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, sort of the connections going on between all of these people. Although Justinian can do so in one sphere, Theodora is able to do it in another, the public and private parts of their lives. That's very interesting. So I suppose if we can look a little further below Belisarius and Antonina and look at women in the army more generally, what evidence is there for their role?
This is a good question. And it's one of the things that I wrestle with. We talked earlier about looking at very specific examples and the depth you can get into with a specific example like this couple, like Belisarius and Antonina. But then it can be difficult to sort of generalize from that specific example. So one of the questions I have of Belisarius and Antonina is just how typical was their marriage? Were there other generals who traveled with their wives on campaign? Or are they particularly unusual? So when you try to look for other examples and think about whether there were women traveling with the army during this time, so sort of that very general question, can we imagine Roman armies on campaign, and do they have their wives, camp followers, like you say, trailing along with them? So one very precious example that we have that might point to this is, again, during that siege of Rome in 537. So we envision Belisarius and the armies hold up in Rome, the Ostrogothic army in siege around the city. And at a certain point during the siege, not surprisingly, food in Rome begins to run low. So Belisarius issued an order that all of the women and children of the civilian inhabitants of Rome should be removed from the city. Quite common during sieges in the ancient and medieval world. But that wasn't all. He then ordered his soldiers to do the same if any one of them had a female maid or slave with them.
Right.
So this is interesting. So this suggests that the general would expect his army in campaign. So this is not just, they're not just sitting in garrison, right? They're in campaign in Italy to have female camp followers with them. And the word used in Greek is therapena, which refers to a maid or a slave. But as we might imagine, there is quite a range of applications for that word. So it's not hard to think that some of these maids or slaves might have been concubines, long-term girlfriends, or otherwise sexual partners of the soldiers and officers in the Roman army. So they're ordered to be sent away. That they can be ordered to be sent away suggests that they exist, and therefore suggests that Belisarius is not the only one with his significant other, with the woman with him on the campaign. So this is like a tantalizing little glimpse, and that's all we get of it. We don't get like a number. Wouldn't it be lovely if Procopius had recorded, and then 8,000 women left the camp, or 800 women left the camp, or 80 women left the camp? Like, wouldn't it be nice to know the size here that we're talking about? But we don't. But some number of women were with the camp while the army was on campaign. And if that's the case on campaign, we can imagine it's even more the case when the army is in winter camp or in garrison along the limes, along the frontier or something like that.
I think we have a lot more evidence for garrison troops because, there's laws, of course, which can be helpful. So, like, I know the Limitani frontier troops often had wives and things which would be, well, maybe not in camp, but nearby. So they're sort of raising families and so on, and also owning slaves and so forth. So I don't know if that also applies to the field soldiers in this period. Certainly the more static troops probably had a lot more roots laid down. I suspect Also in sieges, non-combatants appear a lot more because in these situations you have the whole population pitching into the defense for doing one thing or another. So maybe that's why in the siege of Rome, Antonina's doing so much more than Procopius would normally report, because her role is enhanced so much because it is a siege rather than a field battle.
Yes, that's an interesting point, that the setting within a siege, within an urban environment, and we know Antonina is herself an urbanite. She was born in either Thessaloniki or Constantinople, most likely. So she'd probably be much more comfortable in that environment and at home and ready to do something than perhaps in the middle of the campaign in the field. So we don't hear much about her, for example, between the landing of Belisarius and the army in North Africa and their arrival at Carthage. We know she's with the army, but she's not particularly doing anything noteworthy during that time period.
I want to come back to Belisarius slightly. What would his place in society be? Would he be part of the gentry or sort of a more warrior class? What was his background? And also, was his background typical of generals in this period?
This is a difficult question to answer. One of the few gaps in our biography of Belisarius, when we look at all the sources we have of him, is what exactly his early life was like. So we know, thanks to Procopius, his hometown, which was a town named Germania. It's today's Separavia Banja in Bulgaria. So we know where he came from, but we don't know what the class of his parents were. Were they well off? Were they decurions, town councilors? Was his father himself a military man? We don't know. It's equally possible his father was a poor subsistence farmer. We don't know about Belisarius's parentage or the class his parents came from. And we do know that there were certainly many generals of this period who were like Belisarius from the Balkans and were also probably of relatively poor background. The Emperor Justinian and his uncle Justin themselves seem to have come from relatively poor rural Balkan backgrounds. We don't know about the start of Belisarius' career, but certainly his military service is what brings him up in society. So we do know that service within the army, in particular holding the office of general, automatically promotes an individual to the same civilian rank as senators. So Belisarius, simply by virtue of becoming a general, becomes an illustrious senator within the Roman world. He has the right to sit in the Senate. And then when Belisarius defeats the Vandals, he's given the office of consul, the ancient republican office, which is still being appointed each year. And this brings him up to the very top rank of the Senate. So whether he started out ennobled or not, he certainly is, by the end of his life, one of the most significant and important persons within the empire. And I think that says a great deal about the way service in the army can change a person's status during this period.
Also, the potential for social mobility in the Roman Empire at this point as well. You do have people that can start out with very humble backgrounds and rise to quite high positions.
Yes, although this does not go unchallenged. We know from Procopius's secret history, for example, that there is classes of elite Romans who continue to look down their nose upon these newly ennobled people who've had this social mobility. Although this itself is not new, it goes back very far in Roman history to the Republic. Yeah, I was thinking of Cicero, the new man who other senators with long family traditions sneered at. So this is not a new thing in Roman history.
No. With writing your book, what kind of things did you find the most fascinating to learn about Belisarius and Antonina that you didn't know before or became more so researched it?
I think what fascinated me is the degree to which various episodes in their lives can be confirmed by other sources. So every person who knows anything about the reign of Justinian or the life of Belisarius, of course, knows about Procopius, whom we've mentioned many times over the course of this discussion. But although he is our main source, for sure, there are many episodes of their lives which can be confirmed with other sources, which I really enjoyed being able to do over the course of writing the book. One in particular that stands out to me, I'll just mention one, is the deposition of Pope Silverius. In March 537, just as the siege of Rome was starting, we know that Belisarius and Antonina together deposed Pope Silverius and supported the elevation of a new pope, Vigilius. And this was because it was alleged that Silverius had Gothic sympathies and therefore was a risk to the city while it was under siege by the Gothic army. So we have a brief mention of this deposition of the old pope and elevation of the new pope in Procopius, but it is confirmed by multiple Western sources. We have the Book of the Popes, the Liber Pontificalis. We have Victor of Tanuna. He's a North African chronicler. We have a couple of others that mention that Belisarius and Antonina did this thing. And what's fascinating about it is they credit both spouses. So we get this very rich image from the Liber Pontificalis of Belisarius and Antonina together in a room, and Silverius is brought in, and it's Antonina who interrogates the Pope and declares that he is no longer Pope, and then he's led away, and his vestments are stripped from him. So it's fascinating to think that these elements of their lives, Belisarius and Antonina's lives, which appear in Procopius, can be corroborated by other sources entirely to show us, yes, these things really did happen. They're not just the active imagination of Procopius.
No, the 6th century in general is very source rich, unlike the 2 centuries either side of it. So you've got John the Lydian and John Malalas as well, which are quite detailed, although talking about very different things. I was just wondering, what sort of economy of Belisarius? Do we get a insight into his finances or financial position as he's rising during his career?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I could speak for quite a while on this. I get very excited about this and nerd out a little bit. And actually, there is a whole appendix in my forthcoming book on the wealth of Belisarius. So one of the things I wrestled with is trying to figure out just how rich was this man, because I find the things he was able to do are very interesting. He was able to sustain these campaigns, which the regular army was, of course, sustained by imperial funds, but Belisarius had his own guardsmen with him. And these guardsmen must have been quite expensive.
Bucellari.
Yes, the Bucellari. To maintain just 1,000 guardsmen, Bucellari, I estimate that Belisarius would have had to spend twice his annual salary as a general, for example. And we know that at various points in his career, he had more than 1,000 guardsmen. Famously, at the end of his first campaign in Italy, when he captured Ravenna, he allegedly had 7,000 guardsmen under his command. So clearly, Belisarius has great wealth, even beyond what his salary is as a general, to be able to pay for all of these soldiers to be with him, let alone all the other expenses we'd expect of a rich Roman gentleman, various houses, estates, slaves, servants, servants for his wife, all this kind of thing. So Belisarius was, I believe, staggeringly wealthy, but it's very difficult to get at what exactly that wealth was. But There is a rumor presented in Procopius that he and Antonina siphoned off portions of the treasuries they captured, the Vandal treasury in Carthage and the Ostrogothic treasury in Ravenna. And that certainly would go some way to explaining where all this money came from for him to pay for these soldiers. So I'll give just one figure so that we don't belabor the point. But we know that Belisarius was disgraced in 542, and his wealth was confiscated at that time. When he was restored to favor about 7 months later, he received his wealth back, but Procopius tells us that the emperor kept 3,000 pounds of gold as almost sort of a fine or a penalty. So 3,000 pounds of gold in 542 was considered just a fine on Belisarius's wealth.
Yes.
It's not possible to estimate how big a fine this was. Was this 1/3? Was this 1/10? It's not clear, but clearly this means he had quite a bit of wealth if the emperor could keep 3,000 as just a fine. Just to compare that, to give us something to compare with, in the year 532, Justinian laid out 4,000 pounds of gold to begin the construction of Hagia Sophia. And this was considered to be an extremely generous expenditure to build a church. So the great church of Hagia Sophia started with 4,000 pounds of gold, and that's only a third more than the fine of Belisarius' wealth. So I think that's maybe indicative of how wealthy this man was.
I was just thinking, actually, a few other examples. I know in the fragmentary history of Olympiodorus, there is a fragment where he actually breaks down how much money senators would spend on the games in Rome. This is 424. There's a games held in Rome during the brief reign of John, and for a lower end senator, they get about £1,000 of gold per year in total. Their earnings, and that sort of ranges between 4,000 and 1,000. So, yes, there's no such thing as a poor senator. And also, closer to the times, John Malalas talks a lot about how much money the emperor and sometimes the empress are spending on Antioch, which is the city he lives in. And he details the sums of money which are being sent there. So there's quite a lot of imperial investment being sent out. It's not quite the same, but it does, I think, help put into perspective what kind of money is being thrown around in the high end of society. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but there's an earthquake in Antioch, and Malalas says that Theodora is the one that sends this money to them, although Procopius says I think he says it's Justinian and Theodora.
Yes, I think that's the right kind of comparison. It seems that the kind of wealth Belisarius was expending is in line with probably imperial expenditures like that, like restoring Antioch or building Hagia Sophia. And this is probably why there's if there is jealousy of Belisarius' wealth, why there is, because he seems to be, if not matching the imperial court, he seems to be in the same league, which is kind of outrageous.
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's something that Professor Peter Saris talks about in his Society and Economy in the Justinian era, that lots of, based on the Egyptian Oxyrhynchus papyri, there are quite a lot of receipts with big landowners in Egypt owning lots of land. So a lot of the wealth directed towards these large estate owners, so senators and so forth. I must wonder how many, did Belisarius get control of lands in the conquests he made, or were granted them inside the empire as his career progressed?
That's a great question. Certainly it seems possible. We have no indication from the sources that he owns extensive landed estates in Africa or Italy after his wars there, but it doesn't seem impossible. The only thing we know for certain is that after Antonina had arranged for the disgrace of the Praetorian prefect John the Cappadocian, she and Belisarius received his mansion in Constantinople, almost sort of as a tip for their service in helping them get rid of this Praetorian prefect. So that's one example of them sort of earning property after doing some kind of task. So it's not impossible to imagine that Belisarius might have also earned, extensive estates in these lands for his victories there.
I kind of have a few more miscellaneous questions, but I think the main points have been covered. And I was thinking, what is Belisarius's relationship with Narses? Because I know when Narses appears in Italy, he's there as Justinian's man to sort of keep an eye on him, and also splits the command into two.
There is, as far as we can tell, tension between the two when they are both in Italy. It's not clear whether they have a relationship outside of that moment you mentioned, when Justinian sends Narses to Italy with reinforcements in the 530s. Logically, they would have run into each other, both of them being close to the Emperor Justinian, both of them waiting upon Justinian in the court, at least for Belisarius when he's not out on a campaign. So they must have known each other. They must have been, to some extent, rivals for influence in the imperial court. This is something that is not made clear to us. It's not articulated by Procopius. So it's very difficult to tell. I think the rivalry that happens in Italy is more a rivalry between Belisarius and John, the nephew of Vitalian, than between Belisarius and Narses. Belisarius and Narses are the two sort of protagonists, but it seems to be John who really drives the wedge between them during their time in Italy. So I think the networks, the webs here are complicated.
I suppose that follows into another question, in that why was Belisarius recalled in the 550s?
So Belisarius is recalled in 549. He makes it to about 549, late 548. January 549 is probably when he leaves Italy. And he is recalled on his own initiative, or perhaps on his wife's initiative. So I mentioned earlier that Belisarius and Antonina had decided that Antonina should travel to Constantinople to seek reinforcements from Justinian through the agency of Theodora. When Antonina arrives in Constantinople, she finds that Theodora is dead. And at this point, Antonina changes the plan. Instead of approaching Justinian to ask for reinforcements, she asks Justinian to recall Belisarius and bring him back to Constantinople. Whether she does this entirely of her own initiative or whether she and Belisarius had cooked up this plan in advance is not clear, although I tend to think they had this plan together. So I envision it as sort of a priority list. The first priority was to get reinforcements so that Belisarius could prosecute the war in Italy in the way he thought it needed to be done. And the second priority, if that was not possible, then Belisarius wanted to be recalled because he'd been in Italy for 5 years at that point, scraping by with very few soldiers. And I think he was tired and didn't see an end to the campaign in sight. So getting recalled was his way of extricating himself from a quagmire. So Belisarius leaves Italy in 549 and returns to Constantinople. And then a couple of years later, Justinian decides at length that he's ready to prioritize the war in Italy, puts together an army worthy of the name, and gives it to Narses, who then travels to Italy and defeats the Goths at Tagenae and other battles to bring about the end of the war.
So we've covered a little bit about the pair's military and political affairs, a little bit about the economic and social status. I was just wondering if there was any other little nuggets about them which maybe don't fall into any of those categories, which you would like to talk a little bit more about.
Sure. So the big teaser here is that there is a substantial personal disagreement in the lives of Belisarius and Antonina. And it is presented to us through Procopius's secret history, his salacious invective, which is difficult to take at face value.
In fact, I was
But
going to ask you about Belisarius and Antonina in the secret history as well. So this is a good segue.
Yes, it fits in well. So Procopius claims in the secret history that Antonina had an extended sexual affair with the pair's adopted son, Theodosius. So Belisarius and Antonina adopt a young man named Theodosius shortly before they embark upon the Vandal campaign in 533. And then from 533 up until 541, we are told Antonina carries on an off and on sexual affair with Theodosius, hiding it from Belisarius, occasionally arguing about it with Belisarius, until Belisarius eventually finds out for sure, loses his temper, imprisons Antonina, sends his stepson to track down Theodosius and arrest him. And the whole thing ends up in Constantinople in the mediation of the Empress Theodora. So there's this lengthy story of personal intrigue, which is both outrageous and fascinating. And that forms one of the major sort of connecting strands of my book, is trying to untangle the complicated lines that hold this tale of adultery together.
Natural question to ask is there much stock to be put in it? Would it change our opinion of Belisarius if it was entirely true? Or Antonina, for that matter?
Well, my spoiler alert is that I think that there's not much stock to be put into it, and I think it's a tale woven to make them look bad, but a tale without merit. I think that it does change the way we look at them if we think it is true. For many centuries, in fact, I think historians have bought this story all the way and believed it to be true. And so we have many evaluations of Belisarius, which include phrases like, he was a great general, but he did these great things, but yes, and the but is always followed by, yes, he was, quote, subservient to his wife, and his wife led him to commit many crimes because she was terrible. And while this has some impact on the reputation of Belisarius by making him appear to be sort of a cuckold and a submissive to his wife, it has even more impact on the reputation of Antonina, who I think has been unjustly ignored for her very successful career, and instead painted as this arch seductress and adulteress. That if the story is true, maybe that was a portion of her life. I don't think it was true, but even if it is true, that's still only a portion of her life, and she still has all these other things she's done, like travel on military campaign, lead a resupply effort in Rome, depose a pope, disgrace a praetorian prefect, and all of that is sort of shunted aside to focus on the salacious story of her adultery and her affair and her domination of Belisarius. So I think that the story has had a negative impact on how historians look at her, because it's encouraged them to not look in a more nuanced way at her career, to instead be contented with this scandalous story.
It's a very interesting and tricky source, secret history. It's got lots of interesting things in it, and some of which you'd never see in talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty of Justinian's reign, which you don't see in the history of the wars. But then it's full of all of these other things, like it's lambasting Justinian and Theodora, it's making fun of Justin, who's a complete illiterate, and his wife, who's a hypocrite, Belisarius and Antonina, for reasons you just mentioned. So
yes,
it's
a fascinating
that comes
text.
Out well.
Yes, we could probably do an entire episode on the secret history easily. But you're right; nobody comes out well in it, and there's some reason to be suspicious of that.
I think the funny thing is as well is that for some of it, you have to wonder. Procopius even lets the reader know that he's even a little bit suspect about what he's writing. So, especially the more sort of superstitious stuff, which he ends up talking about. I suppose, why write it in the first place if that's... But I suppose it depends on the content. As you say, the secret history, you could write a book about it. I think some people have, so...
Yes, quite a lot of biographies of Procopius or assessments of Procopius as a historian tend to come down to how the person thinks the secret history was written and why it was written. So while the history of the wars is probably his more important work, I think the secret history gets a lot of attention.
And no one cares about buildings.
Yes, the buildings is sadly ignored in the corner.
If there's anything else you want to discuss while we're here, otherwise I think we could start to wrap up.
I'll just mention that my book, Belisarius and Antonina, is currently in production with Oxford University Press, and it's due to come out in spring of next year. So a little bit of a wait to go still, but I am looking forward to bringing it all to you at that time.
Thank you very much. And I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to this little interview. Thank you very much, Professor Parnell, for coming on and talking about a fascinating story of Belisarius and Antonina. It's been a great pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine.
And this has been Eastern Roman History.